Right.
More strategic and less implementation. Yeah. Well, both are just that's exactly what, yeah.
So did you all plan this? Because
I know.
I know, right? Not.
Except for I need my leverage.
Where's your, I know.
Yeah, I know. Why?
People really respond to issues for every time they're around.
Yeah.
The video should be up now.
Wait, you might know.
Okay, and that's this discussion over here.
There's the digital.
So this guy has a just on his machine. This machine over there.
All good, right?
It was great. I think after I text you, after I got in the room, I fell asleep I think at 7 o'clock.
Oh,
I was gone from like 7:30 to, and I didn't even drink anything. So I was up at 7:30 and I was out. My mom called me at 10, I was
well,
barely
you know,
talking.
I've done enough of this video work to know it's intense. I don't know for a long
I didn't even see a bathroom.
So we'll get started in a couple of minutes.
Yes, ask if you can
Oh, that's just
activate connection so that we can plug that.
no, I cannot physically. Thank you.
that's what I don't know whether this doesn't have a number of times, but I feel like for a couple of days. So TSA move that machine, you know, for that. Okay. Awesome. If you're a new advertiser, we don't know much about you. Use Gmail.
That'll get us going.
It is. I did yesterday.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. We are just about to kick off our morning today, and I hope everyone has their coffee, tea. I like to give myself.
It works.
I hope you have gotten your tea and coffee, your bottled water, nutrients. And as you can see, we've made some schedule changes. The idea was that we decided that we really wanted to make sure to get you into your working groups before lunch. Because we've convened you here because you bring knowledge and expertise that we need, that we all need. You're all leaders in your field. You come from a particular point of view, a particular area of expertise, a particular set of knowledge that we need to bring together into this multi-stakeholder convening. So we want to start hearing from you as soon as possible. So the way the morning is going to work is that we are going to just have really fast committee reports with some discussion, like informative questions, but we're going to be holding like deep dives into the work for the actual committees. So that's going to be our morning, and then after lunch we'll reconvene and go deeper into the committees again. Does anyone have, before we launch in, I wanted to see whether anybody had any realizations, comments. Were there anything, is there anything that came up for you last night as you were talking or meeting or thinking that you wanted to make sure to surface today, that you said, you know, I really was thinking about this all night and or for at least 5 minutes. And I wanted to make sure to bring it to the group's attention. I want to make sure we talk about this today. This is something important for me. Was there anything that came up for you? And I'm going to just pause for a minute just to see if there was anything that rose to the top of someone's mind and wanted to share. Dan.
One thing we chatted about at the mixer last night was, and this is more of a marketing messaging thing, but the more this comes off as kind of the privacy-focused single sign-on versus, say, the LC single sign-on, then I think it starts to like bring in a wider swath of people who like get it when they see it on a page. It's like choosing my Google one or my Facebook one, or that privacy-focused one. And I think it could help.
Thank you. So that was, if you didn't hear on the live stream, that was, if we talk about a privacy sign-on instead of LMC sign-on, that might get wider adoption. Good. Any other thoughts?
I
Michelle?
have a lot, but I'll say just two.
Is this on?
So yeah, of course, I thought a lot about this last night. Two things I thought about. One was making sure that we understand what the benefit to users is in this scenario, and putting that center stage, making that really, really important. The other thing I thought about was the comment that Magdi Amin from the Omidyar Network made when he said that companies use, I talked about this a little at the mixer, use about 5 to 10%, I think it was, 5 to 15% of the data they collect. It's actually valuable to them. I thought a lot about that because it's a message that I think a lot of businesses just do not hear and do not understand the liability of collecting, over-collecting. And so just thinking about how to message that and make that more clear that the advertising ecosystem we're making is also more efficient in a lot of ways.
Linda?
So this is something that I mentioned to Bill last night, and he said you should bring that up. It occurs to me that with, and I know we can parse this a lot of ways, but historically low trust in media, and we're out there telling people they should trust us with their information, that our message is journalists will go to jail to protect your privacy and to protect your information. You know, so to sort of get them out of the bubble about, you know, trust in media might be, do I trust them to, you know, give me balanced points of view? But we're trying to convince them that you should trust your local newspaper or someone else with your information. That is something that is true, and I think it resonates with people that, you know, we do have a long history in our industry and precedence in protecting people's identity and protecting their information and keeping that from prying eyes, including the government. So I think that's just a strength that we have, that we have to think when we do start to roll out messaging that we should, you know, think about, you know, that point.
Thanks. Anybody else have anything they want to share right now? We'll have also a lot of time later today. All right. Well, in that case, thank you very much. Those are really all of them. I'm thinking about them and how we'll incorporate them, those different ideas into our working groups. I want to just launch right into those working group reports. I guess the first one is the End User Consent Committee with Don and Andres. So if you guys want to come up and tell us what you've been thinking about, that would be great.
All right.
Is the audio okay? Okay, yeah.
Oh, here it is, right here. Can you,
Hello.
why don't you hold it and put this one up?
All right, I hope we can get through this in less than 15 minutes because it's a fairly simple, simple report back. In case you haven't seen it, this is Global Consent Manager. Global Consent Manager is a solution for those annoying GDPR consent boxes. And this is a concept that we basically borrowed from LinkedIn. When you go to LinkedIn, they do not ask you to populate your entire profile with a huge amount of information before you can start getting value out of that site. They capture just enough information to get you logged back in, they let you explore the site, and then they let you build up your profile incrementally. It doesn't quite work that way in sites that implement GDPR consent. You show up on the site, and before you can read any of the story that you came for, there's a dialogue saying, please share all your personal information with all these companies you haven't heard of. Most people have been trained to just click OK to make the dialogue go away. They do that, but it turns out that according to user research, this is not creating an optimal trust experience for that site. We tested an alternate consent experience that we built out as a browser extension. And the way the alternate consent experience works is more like when you go to LinkedIn. You show up, you can read a few pages, you can read several pages over a several-day period without getting prompted for consent. We're using the IAB's Transparency and Consent Framework to temporarily set a no consent string. And everybody, all the third parties who are GDPR compliant already know how to handle that consent string. So that user comes in, they get an opportunity to become engaged with the site before being prompted for sharing their personal info. And we ran the user research, and the consent experience with Global Consent Manager is significantly more engaging than the site's original consent experience. We took a group of users and gave them a news task. We gave them the name of a person in the news, a couple questions about the person, said, here's a list of 6 sites. You can browse any 3 or more of these sites. Come back and answer these questions. People are spending way more time with the news when they get the Global Consent Manager experience, not seeing the dialogue right away, than when they see the original experience. And when I've told a couple publishers about this, there's one publisher that says, hey, we're just going to try this out on the server side. So where we are right now with Global Consent Manager is the first set of user testing is done, and we are adding more support for some sites that we have to special case because they're not quite doing transparency and consent framework the way that the standard says that they should. We're adding a few more special case sites. We're going to push this out as a research experiment to a group of Firefox users, and then based on the result of that experiment, decide whether this becomes something that's part of Firefox. And from the browser point of view, being able to say, hey, we've got a better experience on these sites that you go to a lot, especially in Europe, is going to be a big deal. Today, if you install Firefox, then, of course, Firefox doesn't have the same cookies as your old browser did. So you try out Firefox, you go to all your favorite sites, you're going to get bombed with consent dialogues. Not a great experience for somebody trying out a new browser for the first time. We upgrade our consent handling, and that user onboarding becomes a lot smoother, and we should have a better chance of being able to keep more of those new users through those critical first 48 hours with the new browser. So, yes.
The standard on Mozilla, does the standard on Mozilla is to not have browsers hold state, right? So then even when they come back to Mozilla again, won't they be prompted again because Mozilla won't be holding a cookie associated with the login?
The default cookie policy on Firefox is we persist all first-party cookies normally. There is an exception for third-party cookies that's coming in the fall called Enhanced Tracking Protection. And in Enhanced Tracking Protection, some third-party cookies will not be allowed to be set, but a site that has its consent cookie as a first-party cookie, we're going to be able to temporarily populate that from Global Consent Manager. So, yes, first-party cookies work normally on Firefox, and the challenge is the incremental improvements to how Firefox handles third-party cookies and other forms of tracking. So, yes.
You said that the Global Consent Manager experience was significantly more engaging. Can you explain, is that time on site, or what is the measure of engaging? And then also, did you measure, like, you said that it's not a very trusted experience, so did you measure trust in this?
We measure purely by engagement, by total number of seconds taken to do that news task. And the trust is just a hypothesis for now. We have not done a trust survey. There's a previous Mozilla study on engagement by users of ad blockers that tends to indicate there's a higher trust if people are seeing fewer third parties they don't understand on a site.
Is there a plan, or could this down the road be potentially integrated with the SSO tech stack?
It's the web. You can integrate everything with everything. No, I know that IAB Transparency and Consent Framework is very flexible, and it's definitely possible to integrate consent with other flows, such as setting up an SSO account.
So I think a lot of pubs will probably want to kind of think about, how much am I losing during those initial visits in exchange for what am I gaining by making the ask when we have a better relationship with the user. And so were you able to get any data on higher consent rates or something like that if someone was asked later in the relationship?
We don't have data on that. We have data on user engagement, because that was really what's important for moving this thing along through the Firefox process. What we do know is that publishers can see their own numbers, but they don't see the numbers on fraud sites that are directly competing with them. And so if a user running Global Consent Manager is clicking through to something that their uncle sent them, and they realize this is bogus, and they leave and they never come back to that site again, that site never gets the chance to capture consent. So from the point of view of the legit publisher, you're now holding that sustainable advantage in consent, in being able to do third-party stuff that the low-value site that somebody just looks at it and bounces will never be able to do.
And one of the things to remember,
Your mic, never mind.
one of the things to remember is that under GDPR, well, we'll still have to see how the opinions go on the courts, but it's not about just clicking, okay, you can track me everywhere. Like if the users click okay, it's not okay, you can track me, it's okay, you can not do anything, because the default has to be privacy under GDPR, and we still have to see how that's going to play out. So users just clicking yes is actually, if you intend to use this way of making money for your site, that's a very bad way, because the users are trained to click on that button, and under GDPR, that's going to be a bad thing. I think it's a good thing, but from the business perspective of people that just want to do tracking, that's going to not be the greatest thing. If you follow a framework where you are actually being smarter about how you ask for that consent, then you might have a higher rate. And this is going to be happening also under CCPA. So this is not just like, oh, let's see how we get more clicks. The reality is changing on how users interact with those consents that we're seeing because of GDPR. That's the truth.
Yeah, consent is going to be a scarcer but more valuable resource than just clicks on the OK button. At least if you follow what some of the regulators, and I think it's Ireland, they're making some noise about this.
Yep.
So everyone's still on roughly their first or second implementation of GDPR, and there's a lot of stuff on the regulatory and technical side that needs to get refined a little bit. All right. Oh, sure, CCPA. CCPA, we are nowhere near as prepared for CCPA now as we were prepared for GDPR when we had that much time on the clock for GDPR. CCPA has a bunch of amendments in the California legislature that are queued up, and some of them are being withdrawn. The ad tech exemption was withdrawn by the representative or the legislator who put it through. So it's still up in the air in the legislative branch, and as far as the executive branch goes, the Attorney General is supposed to write some key regulations on how CCPA opt-outs are going to work. GDPR, of course, is consent-based. CCPA is not really the California GDPR because CCPA is opt-out based. However, there should be some commonality in workflows between the objection provisions of GDPR, which is Article 21, and the another person opt-outs in CCPA. However, the text of the CCPA says the Attorney General is supposed to give us the regulations on how we handle these opt-outs. And we don't have any regulations from the Attorney General yet. And all the big internet platforms are going to be able to throw a mob of 24-year-old PHP programmers on implementing these regulations as soon as they come out. And the challenge for publishers is to also be able to implement these in a publisher-friendly way. So when those regulations come out, it's going to be crunch time.
Nothing to add.
Yep. Any questions?
I'm not sure if you have time, but I've installed it, but I'm really not sure what it does.
Well, since you're in the USA, you're probably not seeing a lot of the dialogues. A lot of the dialogues that we support are European sites in Europe. So if you're in the UK and you go to the BBC site or the Telegraph, then you're going to get some different consent experience. If you're really interested in trying it out and getting a European-like experience, there's a site called we can talk after the thing. It's definitely focused on European users in Europe for now, and then adding CCPA support, we'll have to do that when we know what CCPA support really means. All right, yeah, it looks like we've still got a couple more minutes. Anything else on consent? Oh, yes.
I'm just curious what it looks like once someone continues engaging after the no consent was sent, and is it incremental asking for consent, or does after 5 pages does a full consent form come up?
Right now we are just clearing out our temporary consent cookie and allowing that site to present its original consent experience. So we would like to be able to build a better user experience that applies to the whole IAB transparency and consent framework. That's not in scope right now, so we are doing the basic change that makes the biggest impact.
So Don and Andres, I'm going to ask this for all the different groups. What kind of feedback, do you want to have a working group this morning? And if so, what kind of feedback or involvement do you need from people here?
Well, I want to refine the way we handle consent management. I would really like to go beyond this idea of click OK to make this dialogue go away, and make consent something that a site a user trusts can get, and a site that a user may not choose to trust doesn't get. Can we make consent meaningful?
And especially, I think, for us, it's really important to see that we're putting a lot of weight on the user to make the decision on whether they trust or not a site. And a lot of, oh, there's all these third parties, trust them. Why? It's a lot on the user to do that for every site. So we can find a way of leveraging that and reducing that amount of work for the user. Of course, the sites will benefit of getting better interactions, but we'll also benefit the users because we'll allow them to actually make meaningful decisions that they can actually understand and actually have a better impact on their privacy.
So I just want to make sure I understand it. So if that dialogue is going to come up for me as a user when I visit a European site, and I click on it and say, yes, I want that experience. And so then if I visit any other site in Europe, let's say, the little cookie consent thing is not going to come up on any site that I visit unless I go 2 to 3 pages into it. Is that right?
So without Global Consent Manager, every new site you visit is going to give you some kind of consent dialogue.
Right.
And so as a European user installing a new browser, then every one of your favorite sites you visit is going to give you this dialogue saying, please click OK to make all this complicated stuff go away. That's the default. With Global Consent Manager, we pre-populate the consent cookie that gets sent to that site as a first-party cookie. And we say, this user has already decided not to consent to anything. So that site, since it already has a consent cookie for that user, is not going to show its consent dialog. Now, Global Consent Manager's consent cookie doesn't last beyond your first few visits to the site. So once you've been to the site a few times, Global Consent Manager clears out its own cookie, and the next time you go to the site sees, oh, there's no consent cookie, I'm going to present the consent dialog. So you end up seeing consent dialogues, but only on the sites that you repeatedly interact with that it appears that you trust. A site that you just click through once, Global Consent Manager is going to temporarily say, I don't trust this site yet, and you're going to have the opportunity to check that site out as a no consent user before eventually getting prompted for consent.
So from a working group standpoint, I'm not fully sure kind of where this group starts and stops and where Brendan's group on tech infrastructure starts and stops. But it feels like there's some thorny issues around once someone signs on to this network we're talking about, how data is going to be shared or protected or what have you from a user expectation standpoint. And so from a working group, are you kind of tackling that question to where user shows up to LMA member 1 and says, yes, I'm good to go, and then they show up on LMA site 2, what is that user consented to across those, or what, like, is that what this working group's going to tackle? Or?
Well, in LMC, you're dealing with the USA, which is more likely to be concerned with CCPA style, which is opt-outs, not opt-in. So from the point of view of a US publisher, there isn't that immediate need to get consent, and until we have this consent bit, we can't do anything. But from the US publisher's point of view, there's some yet to be defined opt-out mechanism. And we can either build out that opt-out mechanism in a way that gives a sustainable advantage to sites that the user trusts, or we can kind of settle for the default implementations of opt-out mechanisms, which are probably going to be defined to be friendly to whatever third-party trackers put them out. So it's a question of how do you implement CCPA to give an advantage to trustworthy sites in the same way that we've implemented GDPR and TCF to give an advantage to trustworthy sites.
So I'm going to ask you to stop there because it's starting to get technical. And I think that Dan's question is a really good one, which is how is the global consent, and this was also Eva's question, how is the global consent manager going to work with the tech stack that we also want to build? And so I think this is a great time to say goodbye to Don and Andres and bring on Brendan to talk about the tech stack, because then we can have further questions after that. One of the things I really want to make sure about is as we're doing the more technical stuff, some of you here are super technical and in your work, you're dealing with all these acronyms all the time, and you know about cookies and all that sort of thing. Some of you are coming more from the policy place and also know a lot about acronyms and CCPA and that sort of thing. And some of us are learning. So if you feel like you don't understand something, please ask for clarification. One thing is, even if other people think that they understand it, sometimes the stuff is wrapped around in such a way that even people who are spending all their time thinking about it still benefit from clarification. So don't hesitate if you feel like, I'm lost, I don't get this. Hey, Brendan, I think what we're going to do is, for the live stream, why don't you just wear one of these things on your head. Okay.
Is everybody ready?
Yeah.
Who slept more than 6 hours last night? Because I gotta say, put it this way. All right. Go. I'll keep my hair out of that. I have 2 3-year-olds at home, as well as a 5-year-old, and getting more than 6 hours of sleep is a treat. So today I want to talk through where we are in the technology stack draft, but also to really start that with an understanding, because we do go deep in technology, but start with an understanding of the set of requirements and the scenarios that we're really looking at handling. So in our last session as an entire group, we had some really strong conversation about the opportunity, where we really wanted to focus the initial technical work in a way that had a strong business case so that we could have low friction for adoption. So we've heard allusions to, we've heard a lot about GDPR, we've heard a bit about Consent Manager just now, and we've also heard a little bit in the background conversation about privacy protecting technologies. Now, Donald talked through 3 different types of privacy protecting technologies. For non-technical deep dive, we can say there is a class of software that affects what type of opportunity a publisher has for delivering advertising to an audience, to a visitor. And that is a subset of visitors to the site at this point, and that subset of visitors to the sites is not as valuable on a per impression basis because they're not receiving advertising. This is for advertising-driven websites, obviously, at this point. So we have this confluence of factors. We have the growing adoption of privacy-protecting technologies. We have legislation in various markets, GDPR in the EU and CCPA in California, and the expectation that we'll see some hopefully federal policy guidance instead of a patchwork of statewide legislation on privacy coming to the United States over the next little while. And then we always have what we've been seeing is a growing or a shrinking revenue from third parties as you have a growing ad ops cost when you're delivering creative. And I know IAB's been doing some solid work on kind of making transparency in that supply chain, but it still remains a cost to doing business. You're partnering with third parties, and therefore you're not making as much money as you would potentially if you were going directly. So we do have an opportunity, a target audience, to really try out an updated technology stack that works differently. And the starting audience for that one is that set of users using privacy-protecting technology and having an engagement with them that changes the conversation from, hey, don't do anything, to what can we do? Then making sure that the technology that we build initially is capable of rolling out to a larger conversation. And I think, Dan, you were raising this of like, let's have the conversation not as LMC's technology, but as a privacy protecting thing. So moving to a conversation where you've got an interface for having a better conversation about a privacy-centric delivery system, and then ultimately getting to a place where we've got large swaths of the internet, large swaths of your visitors using technology that has a much more privacy-centric conversation than the existing things. So working on language, the overall goal is to do this prototype and this is kind of a recap of what we're going to go through, to have, I haven't memorized this, my apologies. That's a little bit loud when I get close to that. To have credentials that work across a federation of sites, local publications, that there's a partnership with those publications for managing privacy preferences and data, and that there is the capability for other scenarios to be built atop this collaborative permission system. A set of core scenarios that we were evaluating or keeping in mind as we're going through all these, through this planning phase and evaluating the different technologies. One, that it be an authentication system that was an alternative to existing ones, and this is an allusion to things like Facebook Connect and Google Sign In with Google. Hey, what we want to have an option that is, as was mentioned this morning, the privacy-centric one, a useful option there. That we go towards a system that has sufficient aggregate insight into users, that it is a valuable commercial signal, and that it's sellable, that this audience is sellable in a privacy-compliant way. That there is that relationship between the publisher that the user has decided to set up an account with, that they can have a conversation that does withstand, current and incoming legislation, so that there is a real clear story of we sought consent and we did it in an understandable way every step of the way, that then we also look at some additional scenarios. Advertising isn't the only scenario that we want to have long-term, having the ability to do microtransactions, to deliver a subscription that starts in one place and then allows broader access without paying the 30% or whatever it is, 50% tax that Apple News has introduced. That's another core scenario that was kept in mind. So one of the core things, one of the questions we had come away with at the end of last larger session was, do we want to do authentication? Do we want to do verification? Do we want to do identification? And these are a little bit of a technical one, but I just wanted to share a hopefully broadly understandable set of these definitions. Authentication is when you sign in with a username and password, or you have a very strong way of proving that it is a specific human. Verification is a weak way of probably associating something with a human based on some of their action. So going back to the days of IRC, I would sign into a channel and I'd just type in, hey, this is my nickname. And it was just my common thing of using my same nickname. There wasn't anyone really protecting that other than my presence. Email, where you're saying, hey, give me an email address, and then not doing the follow-through of verifying that and verification is not the best name for it, but that's the name we presented this concept with last time, so I'm sticking with it. And identification is the way that we're doing things now, cookie-based server-side algorithms that do device fingerprinting, household identification through device proximity, geographic location, all of those different methods of identifying a single or a group of devices that have, we were having a conversation last night about, oh, that's why my roommate is really into bikes, therefore I'm getting bike advertisement because I'm on the same Wi-Fi at the same time. So that type of, that's identification, really weak server-based determining. So we've, having the conversation, we said authentication is the way that we have to go for the scenarios that we're looking at supporting. And authentication does have a path towards using something, right now, authentication really should be username, password, not two-factor yet, but as soon as we start doing billing information, we'll probably have to consider supporting that. And also, authentication does set the expectation that we could potentially go into a self-sovereign identity integration, SSI type thing. Yes?
What is self-sovereign identity?
Why don't you have a chat with...
Offline.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other ones? All right. So, great question, and it will be discussed. So, with regards to advertising infrastructure, we looked at 3 different examples along this spectrum of cost to trust. And it turns out that the less you trust other people, the more it costs you in terms of resources to develop. If you want to trust nobody, you've got to build it all yourself, and that's expensive. If you want to trust everybody, then it's pretty cheap. You can go to Google and be like, hey, you can do it for us. So we looked at a breadth of different advertising options, from getting some open source code and running our own ad servers through to just going out and using a third party. And I think they're fairly, I won't do too deep of a dive into these ones because I'm out of time. But the recommendation that the group has come away with is white label, having at least a C-named thing and some clear business guidance around what's allowed is the way that we need to go. With regards to data storage, we do envision a separate profile store, user data storage that is separate from the existing CRMs, that does have API, application programming interfaces for, at minimum, existing CRMs to push data in a permissioned way into. So if you've got existing insight, you can push that in with user permission for additional ad targeting options. And that has to be able to push into, go ahead.
Are you talking about a data storage system for each publisher, or are you talking about a central data storage system that would aggregate everything?
So here's the ultimate.
Actually, I like this better. And can you just remind people what CRM means?
Yep. Yeah, so CRM is your customer relations management database. That's where any of your subscription data would be. The site is actually, you could call it a CMS, your content management system, where you're delivering content. Auth is the authentication interface. This component does imagine an area where multiple potential ITAGA certified authentication systems coexist and interoperate. So, our dream is to support not just a single auth methodology, but a variety of them, whether it's ClickShare and Shibboleth and SSI, how they all mash together. The dream is to have interoperability so that ITAGA can verify and say those ones. But ultimately, in this model, the existing relationship is augmented by authentication, by having a sign-in method. That stores data that can have additional information pushed into. that all goes in a controlled way up to the ad system that augments the advertisement that's delivered on each of the sites. Go ahead.
So again, one of the concerns that we have heard from privacy people is not a good idea to store data from multiple sites in the same place. Is this direct data, or is this like anonymized data that you're storing?
So it is user data. So and it's permissioned user data. So the concept the concept is fundamentally that the user has a relationship with a network of sites, but that information that each site chooses to put in is controlled by the relationship. So if you are storing a large amount of data about a lot of sites, that's potentially problematic. But if you have a relationship with that is push-based and permissioned, and that expectation is I'm signing into a network, that should assuage a lot of the concerns.
Yeah, because I thought the original idea was that the user data would stay with the site CRM, and that it would only push anonymized data to a central federated site.
Yes, we're getting into technical side of things, but yes, so the information coming from here to here is abbreviated and minimized, but it is going to be associated with an authenticated user through the system. Just like you need to have an ID, you're going to assign it to an ID, and that's going to be, you can consider that anonymized or not. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say the reason for that is because you want that data store to be able to aggregate information from multiple sites in the network to make the data more valuable. And if it's totally anonymized, you can't do that.
Go ahead.
So one of the aspects of this that we proposed is beyond consents, individual controls.
Yes.
For people. Where would those play a role in here? I guess at what point, sort of timing wise, and also how does that follow the person?
Yeah, so any of the authentication, so the interface here, if the site is going to prompt you for a login. The login is going to be mediated through the Itega infrastructure. And then as part of seeking permission to flow additional information into the central store, that's when the site would promote that type of interface.
So if they changed it changes automatically. In other words, if somebody says 5 minutes ago they're okay with that, but then the change, I don't want to be
Right.
Then it's sort of
that would be like the authentication interface, and this talks to APIs, which is an area that we need to work on and define in our sessions later. But that set of like change scenarios and push scenarios are things that we need to document the API and say what are the scenarios, what are the specific scenarios that are needed, so that you can have both those ones supported. Yeah. Okay. I am out of time,
Well, go ahead.
and I'm out of slides.
Oh, you're out of slides. Well, that's good.
So-
Go back one slide just quickly.
Yeah. So what I was talking about, hey, the creation and documentation of APIs to push information into the CRM, to pull and that type of thing, and then the APIs will control what type of information is in there. And so you do have this cascade of like, okay, the CMS, the CRM has a lot of information, the data store has less information, and even less information is shared with the advertising system. So, go ahead, Dan.
So a lot of what you described had to do with kind of once you've gotten the data,
Yes.
and how you're protecting it, et cetera. I'm still trying to understand a little bit of kind of the where this and consent start and stop. Do you imagine that
consent disclosure and transparency to the user is kind of part of this, or that's the other working groups figuring out how do we talk to users about this and help them understand what they're saying yes to?
Yeah, so what Don's working on with Global Consent Manager is very much a how do we improve the user experience around seeking consent. And I think there will be lessons to take from that for user engagement, like how long do you wait to drive a login, that type of thing. But the two are extraordinarily discrete at this moment. Whereas, so I think there are definitely UI and UX lessons to be learned from Global Consent Manager. But at this point, there's GCM is looking at how do you moderate the request for consent in an anonymized environment. And this is where we got to was this has to be an authenticated environment. So you have to go through that phase of seeking registration prior to having a conversation.
So in talking with Dan, he and the Admiral Group have done a lot of work around helping the user communicate with the user and helping the user along the engagement path. So, Dan, are you involved in?
So I'm involved with this. One of the reasons I'm asking is I'm trying to understand, we also do the consent management, but there are discrete concepts, right? The single sign-on system helps make sure you nail sign-on and authentication. The CMT system helps you make sure you nail
Kind of transparency and making sure that you're only sharing things that people have said yes to sharing or what have you.
Okay, so this is sort of confusing for me now. So there's a consent system. Can we go through that again?
Well, that's part of what I'm trying to understand, right? So there's the idea of kind of, as Brendan's described, authentication, understanding a single user so that we can kind of understand data relevant to them. But then kind of separate and apart from that is kind of what that user is saying you're allowed to do with this data. And at least right now, in other implementations, a CMP is a very different thing than a single sign-on system. What's a consent management provider for like GDPR consent. And so part of what I'm trying to understand as we move forward and like which group to contribute to or what have you is, a lot of what I heard on the consent side was kind of assuming you've already figured out what you want to ask people, Global Consent Manager will figure out how to delay asking them or something like that. But I feel like we need to solve not just like when's the optimal time to ask, we need to solve what are we asking of someone? Mm-hmm. How do they know what they're doing here, that who they're going to share something with or not share? Is that a separate set of yes and no that someone is doing? And so it feels like a discrete problem to tackle than just single sign-on.
So if I can just do something for a second because it will help me.
Yeah.
I want to do like a little physical kind of experiment. So I'm Joellen Kaiser. So I'm coming to a site.
Yes.
And so first the site says, put in your user ID and password, and it says, or whatever. At some point it does.
Okay, yes.
At some point it does.
But the first thing it does is says, so you're Joellen, you're going to a European website.
Yeah.
The first thing the website says is, hey, I would like to track you.
And I say.
Well, do you have Global Consent Manager installed or not?
Yeah, let's say I do.
Okay, so it says, we're already not tracking you.
Okay. But then I come back.
Yeah, we're already not tracking you.
And I come back again.
But we're not tracking you, but we do offer would you like to sign in?
Okay.
Would you like to register? Would you like to sign in?
Okay, so let's say I want to sign in.
Okay, great.
Okay. So
would you like to sign in with Google? Would you like to sign in with Facebook? Would you like to sign in with our privacy-centric?
Privacy-centric.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's sign you in.
I'm going to sign in.
Good. Now you're signed in, and
so now you authenticated me.
We're going to go through an authentication process. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I'm signed in.
Good.
I'm
So
excited.
now we can start doing things that are enabled by that. Maybe you can have permission to comment,
Okay,
right?
that's great.
I'm going to give you that. Maybe, and now as part of that one, we're going to say, oh, do you mind if we create an advertising profile against your authenticated ID?
So let's say I say yes. I have questions about this, but I
Yeah.
just want to understand the process. So
Yeah.
let's say I say yes.
Okay. And then maybe a little bit along, I'll say, hey, can I share a little bit of information with our advertising partners? And I might ask you specifically that type of information, like it looks like you're in, and it looks like you're in this geographic area. Can we share this type
Do
of
I have to
signal?
keep answering your questions because I'm getting really tired of this?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Good point. And that could be a yes, no, everything. It could be a incremental one. It could be we have a campaign going right now. Our advertiser is trying to deliver that type of thing. But that is the window dressing above the pipelines.
Okay.
And like our goal to date has been what are the pipelines. When you start talking about the specific scenarios, yeah, that'll drive requirements. But the core thing right now is how do we get some basic pipes in place?
Okay, so one of the things that this is really helpful, thank you,
Yeah.
Brendan. One of the things I'm seeing is, so now I have other questions that I think we're going to have to answer today, and maybe we can put some of this into Don's group. Why in the world would I want to sign in? Why in the world would I want to take advertising? And why in the world would I want to take tracked advertising? Like, why would I say yes to those three things? So the system is designed, we're creating a system that allows people to do that, but from the user perspective, why would I say yes to any of those three things?
Right.
Like, what is my incentive?
And that's why we have more than just.
Yeah, so I think that we need to find which group is going to talk about that.
An interesting data point was when we, in McClatchy, when I was there, we would ask people to subscribe to newsletters, and within the newsletters, we'd also have, would you like to receive advertising-related information from our customers? And 25% of people said yes.
Yeah.
So as much as you think they're not going to say yes, they do.
Yeah, and the numbers Don shared yesterday had 30% or so people being cool with targeted advertising.
Yeah, I mean, the way we look at it is we're trying to establish a value exchange for providing that information against receiving content.
Yeah.
So if we throw a paywall or a meter at 3 articles, that's all you can read this month.
Yeah.
We'll give you 2 more if you give us your name or whatever. I mean, that whole furthering that progression and how much trust and how much information they're willing to give us, because we know we can get more on the advertising side if we have that information. So
yes, there are carrots and there are sticks. Yeah.
So 2 things come to mind as I'm hearing Don's presentation, your presentation. I wonder if we should, because we have to solve for the user experience along this entire continuum. I wonder if we need to combine these 2 groups to really map out what the user experience is from start to finish. And then the other thing that comes to mind is, do we have any UX experts in the room? And if not, we need to find one.
Yeah.
To make sure as we start going along this path, we have someone in the room that is really an expert on how to create a very seamless, engaging user experience.
Thank you, Brendan. Don, what's your thought about what are your guys' thoughts about combining your groups and then doing like a separate user experience group?
Well, the user experience is the reason to fix consent. So it seems like, well, yeah, we need better user experience. So I'm happy to have user experience people come to the consent group.
Yeah. I think like building the underlying technology would be like, it would look at a user experience as a business stakeholder rather than a like day-to-day execution participant.
Okay, so thank you so much, Brendan. So what we've established now, if I'm hearing it right, if you're interested in user experience, then you should also think about going to Don's group, because the Global Consent Manager group is actually looking at the user experience. Like from the time I approach a website and say, oh, cool website, to when I might actually say, hey, I'm really excited about being a signed-in user that might want to receive advertising and that sort of stuff. So that whole pathway for the user, from just being like, cool site, to like, sign me up for everything, I want to get it all, that's the user experience, and that's part of the Global Consent Manager group. And then if you're actually really more of a tech side person, you really want to understand, okay, this person has just said yes to everything, what's actually happening with their data, and how do we actually keep that data safe as we try to combine it into like some kind of data exchange? I mean, has its own privacy issues. So if you are interested, challenges, if you're interested in that, then you would be going into Brendan's group. Is that really clear? All right. You have one question?
Is there any thought of doing a industry-wide marketing campaign to consumers just about the state of the world and what this all means?
Yes. we actually have worked quite a bit with our PR firm in concepting some ideas around that, as well as looking at opportunities for funding that. So you're absolutely right. Once we determine what we're doing, and it's not only about creating awareness. It's first about creating awareness of the value of local media and the contributions local media makes to the health and well-being of communities, and then for building that awareness, and then through the proper, more tactical marketing channels, asking them to take some sort of action. So I think it's a combination of creating the value and then asking them to hopefully start walking along this engagement path with us.
Okay, great. So as you can see from our schedule, we're running a little bit behind, but not too much. I think if it's okay with you folks, what I would like to do is go ahead with the next two committee reports before we take our break, which will probably give our break a little bit more time. Is that okay with everyone? Okay. So next up is going to be Michelle talking about the next two groups are more policy focused. And the next up is Michelle talking about privacy policy.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Taking so many notes. Okay. Hey, everybody. Be kind. Especially the advocates. This is a daunting task. Oh, thank you. Okay. All right. So, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Don, for the clarity that you've given me in your presentations. That I'm just completely impressed, Brendan, by the way, with the elegance of the system the stack that you created. So it's very challenging, and I'm sure you guys probably got that, but it's especially challenging to then try to layer over all of this a privacy policy. And so most people who have worked in this field know that privacy policies suck majorly, right? I mean, they are long, they're legalistic. I am in this field and I hate reading them, but I have to a lot of times. So my approach here and the approach of this committee was not to necessarily build some long legalistic document, although we realize that this, whatever we recommend, will be incorporated into something, right? Perhaps maybe it will be taken at face value, but it has to be responsive to the GDPR in particular and to the CCPA when possible. Which if you've read the law, you know that that is quite a task too. So the members of this committee, as you can see, Joe Jerome from CDT, Chris Pedigo from Digital Content Next, Johannes Munter from News Media Alliance, Eric Knoll from OTI, and Deepayan Ghosh from the Platform Accountability Project at Harvard Kennedy School. These people were incredibly helpful in just mashing together a lot of different perspectives, which is what we needed to build something that would be both practical. These are recommendations for publishers, so it had to be practical and responsive to that, but it also has to be aspirational at the same time, right? Because of the fact that some of these provisions aren't clear, and because of the fact that we're still building this thing, and we're trying to create something that's actually usable. So in some ways, the recommendations talk about things you might recognize, but it also, I tried to lay out, and this is Deepayan's input a lot, some examples of what we're talking about. So in other words, instead of just saying, do consent right, we say, here's what consent means, here's why it matters, here's how to shift it into something meaningful, and here's ways that you could try to do it. Okay, so I'm just going to go through them as quickly as I can. Oops. Okay, so first we started with definitions, which is, of course, where the rubber meets the road in almost any kind of policy. And the very first thing we tackled was personal information. So, and I should say before I launch into this, what I need from you all in the working groups is your feedback on these choices, because they are choices. And so you'll see GDPR, you'll see CCPA, but you'll also see what I consider privacy advocacy, right? Sort of the gold standard, because we're not trying to just squeak by. We're trying to create a gold standard that is responsive to how sort of what Linda said, which is this meeting of values between journalism and privacy. The stewards of information, the internet maybe, news, media, and the trust that's necessary there, and the upholding of these democratic values. So we decided to use the GDPR's definition of personal information. It's a fairly broad definition. I think it's a strong definition. It essentially says anything that's information related to an individual or an identifiable natural person. So you might be wondering, what the heck does that mean? And it basically means anything that can be tied to an individual. So that does include some aggregated data, right? That does include a lot of data that's collected now and broken apart. It still can be connected to a person. So this is pretty broad, but it's not quite as broad as the CCPA, which of course includes olfactory information. Not going to include that, because I don't even know what that is. Does anyone know what that is? Okay. So the second part, and this is an important part of personal information, because in the CCPA they define household data. So a lot of people are flummoxed about what household data means. I think the way to traverse this is by combining the GDPR and the CCPA to create something that is information relating to an identified individual, or any information relating to someone who could be identified indirectly based on a variety of identifiers, such as through device identification. So what I'm trying to get at here is cross-device tracking, essentially, right? This is what people don't like. This is what is unexpected for most people. I realize it's a very important part of the ecosystem right now in terms of advertising, and that there are some times when you're okay with that. But for the most part, it's opaque, people really don't like it, it's unexpected. And so this household data, I think, to be practical, has to essentially encompass cross-device tracking. Okay, sale of data, and please interrupt if you have questions as we go through. And so you can see I have footnotes here to kind of reference where we pulled the different definitions from the GDPR and the CCPA in particular. Sale of data, very relevant here. There's a lot of questions about what that means under CCPA. I think that any data that is being shared by users and publishers with advertisers, so note the distinction there, should be considered a sale as defined by CCPA. So we cover this mostly in our tech stack and with the Global Consent Manager. If you're going to share info with advertisers, you need to ask permission. And that means pretty much anything, right? Any kind of personal information. So it's comprehensive, I think. And the last definition, yeah?
The sharing of information means if you've got advertiser has knowledge of a person by an identifier, and publisher has identification of the user by an identifier, and it's the same identifier, just making that match so that the advertiser can make the choice to purchase, is that sharing of data?
Well, so the way that the system works, at least I think as far as I understand it, is somebody will come into the system and be asked whether they want to share information with advertisers. So that can include some kind of identifier, probably will, and then other info too, right? If you're okay with being identified by certain general location information, right? So that type of stuff. And all of that has to be done through consent. All of that has to be done with permission. Right? Does that answer your question?
I guess if the basic form does include a standard like DSP cookie that's put down across the web, and then a DSP so the advertising buyer sees its own cookie on the site of a user and recognizes that that's the person they want to buy.
But we don't want advertisers to do that, right? What we want is for the publisher to have the complete control over that information.
So this kind of goes right at the heart of the programmatic ecosystem that I think we're going to get to later.
That's right. That's right. And it has to, right? To be, if we're going to say that this is the gold standard in privacy and this is, we're giving people control and consent is meaningful, it has to rest with the first party. Yes?
Just trying to focus in on what personal data is. So if a newspaper site tells an advertiser, the person behind this browser has viewed these types of articles, and that's all they give them. Is that personal data?
Yes.
Okay.
But not if it's bought on like the auto section, classic contextual though.
Not if it's what?
No. I'm thinking that they have history. They know that in the past they've looked at autos, even if they're not looking at autos right at the moment.
Yes.
Or the auto section of the paper.
That is clearly able to be taken back to a person and identified.
But not by the person you're giving the data to.
Right.
But it's still personal information, even if you're not providing the identifier.
Because it can be identified and traced back to an identifiable person.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
I think Fran has a question. There's no way I'm going to do 15 minutes. I'm going to try, but I just, I got to, well, I don't know about that, but it's important. Yes.
Yeah.
No pressure.
I think it would be helpful to talk about anonymized data versus what you've defined here. So,
okay.
If we're targeting based on anonymized data, just define anonymized versus what you're defining as individual data.
So most of what I would consider anonymized data would probably be personal data under this, most of the way it works now. Anonymized is it depends. It depends on how it's done, right? Pseudonymized certainly, so it really depends on the technical approach to anonymized or pseudonymized data. I would say that if you create a system like the one that Brendan presented that really is only sharing some aggregated data with some identification of at least hashed identification, right? That could be considered anonymized data, and it wouldn't be considered personal data. I don't think that typically the way that you see it done now is there are all kinds of trails connected to a person, and then it's called de-identified or anonymized, and that would be considered personal data, right? So in this system, it's elegant because you're cutting off that opportunity, right? You're saying the first party knows who this person is, and we will share with you whatever they say is okay, but we're not going to tell you who they are so that you can identify them. We're not going to give you those trails, right? So I guess that's why in this I use the word aggregated data more. What? What? Tell me.
I think that the computer science and computer security literature has a lot of examples of re-identification of data, and I don't think we've seen enough evidence to show that there actually is such a thing as an anonymous identifier or a pseudonymous identifier.
Which is why I say aggregate. Yeah. Yeah. Does that help? It's a confusing little world. I would say no. It's kind of an extreme view, but I would say it doesn't really, certainly not in this closed scenario, not really. And I think if you're a publisher and you're trying to be compliant with these different laws, you're going to have to assume that it doesn't either. I think that's the way to go with it.
I have a question about the anonymized data and re-identification, which is, isn't it defined as...
Can you speak up a little bit?
It
doesn't work. It's confusing.
So my question is, isn't it defined in terms of like what are reasonable means of re-identification? So with anonymized data, I mean, since like I agree that there is no really like anonymized data, but I think under the GDPR it's defined as like, is it likely, is it reasonable that someone could re-identify this data using technical means
right.
that are reasonably available? So I'm just wondering if you have a sense of what might be considered those reasonable means.
So Allison was asking, commenting that under the GDPR, anonymized data is defined as anything that can be identified through reasonable means, something like that. And so she was asking, what would we consider to be reasonable means? So I guess what you could say is I sidestepped all of that purposely to say that anonymized data does not really exist in this system, and nor should we sort of pretend that it does. Does that make sense? I guess, yeah.
But Michelle, without getting lost in all the different terms we're using, back to the use case he presented, is it set up so that the policy would forbid me as a publisher having knowledge that Gary is a auto intender because I've done multiple visits across sites looking at car stuff, and now I'm sold as a segment called auto intenders to an advertiser when I'm on the sports page or something? Like, are we allowing that memory of the customer to be presented to the advertiser as long as the advertiser doesn't get anything that they can use to identify that person back?
Yes, I assume what you're saying when you say go across sites is within the LMC to go across these publisher sites.
Yeah, to leave the car section to go to the sports section when clearly
yes. The answer is yes. Yes, but we are asking people if that's okay to identify them in that way, right? We're asking what they are okay with sharing with advertisers. So are you okay with advertisers, identifying you by what you look at?
But there's no
Or
question
publishers.
about if they're on the sports page and they get a sporting goods ad, that's okay. If they're in the auto section, they get an auto ad.
If they say it's okay, yes.
Well, or otherwise it's what, just a random free shot? Like, I mean, you're even willing to undermine classic contextual advertising if they haven't opted in for it?
Yes. I mean, I think the idea is that that's going to be okay, right? I mean, for the most part. But when you're talking about basing it on a person's specific identifiable characteristics, no, it's not, unless they say it's okay.
So the what page they're on, I think, is okay and doesn't require consent.
As long as the ad is served not against the personal identifier, but just against the fact.
Right. If you
Just the fact of, yes.
If you're
yes.
collecting
Yes.
data, and I don't think it matters whether it's on the network or just on your own site. If you're collecting history for that customer and passing their interests along based on that history, then yes, that would require consent. And I don't think it makes any difference if that history is across the network or just within the one site.
Right.
The reason we want to build the network is so that there's more of that data to make the information we give to the ad tech folks more interesting,
Well
if it's
said.
consented.
Thank you. Yes, correct.
Yeah, just another aspect I want to just include in the conversation is that I think there are going to be religious arguments ad infinitum forever about whether or not you can re-identify somebody.
Yes.
We're not going to be able to solve that problem
Which is why I
in
sidestepped.
ITAGA's privacy framework. But an important thing that we're working on that others aren't working on is the idea of a governance structure
True.
that provides sanctions when people do re-identifying in a way that is not appropriate and is not in conformance with ITAGA's rules.
That's right.
So there is that other fire stop
Mm-hmm.
to deal with the problem of, is it technically feasible to re-identify somebody? Well,
Right.
it may be, but if you've done it, you're out of the system.
Yeah. Thank you.
I was just going to point out, based on what was just talked about audience targeting, just the fact that we talked about it last night, the importance of it for news organizations. First off, it goes on today, right now, and it's not going away. But especially for news organizations, if you're just doing contextual or direct sales, a lot of these are, properties are sometimes 100% programmatic. And big brands today do not want to target news sites for various reasons. And if you take out audience targeting, those pages are, they're just going to be on the lifestyle sections of these publishers. And so while all these concerns are very important and valid, once you have the consent and you clearly define how you're building the audience, behavioral, location, and other signals, and one is opted in, it's, I feel it's very needed, especially in this network.
It's a much higher quality audience, right? If you think about how audiences are created now, it's a lot of guesswork, right? I mean, really, you're sort of modeling. It's a lot of modeling, sure. Same thing, kind of. And there are varying degrees of how people measure whether it's accurate or not, or successful or not, right? This, I think, is clearly going to be a much higher quality audience because you will be able, they will tell you, you will know, right? Any other questions on these? Okay. All right, let's go on to purpose limitation. So purpose limitation, anybody who works in advocacy knows, is a really important part of any kind of policy. Usually it gets a lot of lip service. It doesn't get a lot of heft. So what I am trying to do here, what we're trying to do is say, reduce the data collection overall by adhering to purpose specification. So purpose specification can mean, we want to see where you're going on our page, but it has to be limited to functionality. And this is closely tied to storage, right? To holding on to something about somebody and tying it to them. We're saying permission data, so this is including data that they tell you is okay, shouldn't be held for more than 15 days unless required by law for fraud purposes or for functionality. Now, I challenge any advertisers here to tell me why you need it past that time. And I mean this, because I thought long and hard about it, and I think, and there are I've heard lots of arguments, but none of them really, I can't really find a reason to go past 15 days. Except that you don't want to annoy people and ask them all the time. But
in talking about this, identifying interests based on their behavior and what pages they're looking at on a site, are you suggesting that you're only going to keep 15 days of history of what they're looking at?
Yes.
Because I think it's still relevant to show me bicycling ads if I'm only looking at bicycling ads during, like, say, the Tour de France, and it's still, later, around Christmas time, it might still be reasonable to send me bicycle ads, but we're going to lose all that data.
So I think I hear that, and this is part of what I was thinking about, but is there data to support what you're saying? Is it really useful? Is it really valuable?
I have an interest. It's an interest that's time-based, and you're going to lose that fact that I have that interest.
But how do you know that interest hasn't expired?
Do interests expire? I mean,
not so much a question, but I mean, most purchases for over $200 to $300, people are researching those. I mean, the more something costs, and these are the advertisers who would be willing to spend the most to get at folks,
right,
the longer the cycle is. 15 days is very short in a sales cycle for a large purchase.
Well, if the person's interested, they're probably going to still keep looking for whatever it is they're interested in. Am I right?
Back on the data question, though, is where'd you get 15 days from?
It was a little bit random. It was based on a couple frameworks that I saw in state laws that didn't get passed. But the idea being that after 3 weeks, I guess I would be open to, I think the Privacy Committee would be open to negotiating this a little. But I think when you're talking about what you need data for, it really is for that moment. Am I right? It's for that session. To go past that and to have 3 weeks worth of data about a person is pretty valuable. I mean, you've got a lot about what they're visiting, what they're looking at.
So I'm hearing something, and I think that I want to interrupt for a second.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I feel like this
Sorry.
is a conversation that should happen in the working group. I feel that.
That's a good point.
I feel that
Yeah.
there's clearly a problem here.
Mhm.
We're hearing a lot of pushback. I think that what we really wanted from these presentations is to get a sense of where the pushback is, and to
Yeah.
get a sense of if you feel like you need to really intercede on something, that you need to go to the working group.
Yeah.
Because I think we can pass on and say, Michelle, there's a big problem with this 15 days, and
Yeah.
people are going to really push back, and people are going to have to give you more. You need a lot more feedback on that. Because
Okay.
I want to get into those groups, and I feel like we're definitely seeing the hand.
That's a great point. Thank you for intervening. So please join the working group if you have some input on that. Sounds like a lot of people do. So clearly define the purpose of collecting and using data. Let's go into individual controls. The individual controls are a hugely important part of this, even though you don't see a lot of text here. And the reason is because the goal in my mind of consent is to not have to ask for it very much. To use consent as something that's very valuable, very specific, and meaningful to a person. So part of that is giving them some control. It's not just about notice, right? It's about giving them some ways to understand what you're looking at and why you're looking at it and how they can control it, and making those controls persistent. So developing an API that can, not annoyingly, but can follow somebody and give them that information. So we talk about how users don't really have a true understanding of what personal data is at risk, nor are the organizations able to access the data, which renders most requests for consent meaningless. So to make it meaningful, we have a couple ideas here, again from the Shorenstein Center, providing users with a menu of personal data, giving them a threat level. Oops. So here's the nutrition label that you may have heard about, thrown around for a little while. Lori Craner has piloted this a lot. Give them some way to understand what you're doing with their data and why, and whether they're okay with that. There's a threat index. And again, this speaks to some UI UX. So we wanted to make this policy speak to that to a certain extent, because we're saying this is how you should interact with users. The threat index, I think, is interesting. It's pretty clear. The wording might have to change a little bit, but the idea that you're giving people some idea of the risk. And let me just underscore, doing something like this is going to make you very favorable in the eyes of regulators, right? This is not just an exercise in individual control. This is something that really mitigates your risk there. We have data on the menu. Yes?
Is it really risk or cost?
Well, we're talking about for users.
Yeah, I'm thinking for users.
Do you mean
I
like-
mean, I don't think you want to say that sharing your data is risky. There's a cost to it. There's a cost-benefit relationship that you want.
Let's talk about it in the working group,
Okay.
because it might just be a word
I'm
choice.
not going to be able to be in the working group, but okay.
Okay, well,
Maybe someone else will.
I'll bring it up. I'll
Actually,
think
one
about
of
that.
One of the reasons I want to go to the working groups is because I want to do 2 rounds of working groups, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, so people can switch.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I hear that, and I'll think about that. All right, so work with browsers that provide easy-to-use privacy protection levels. You're welcome, Mozilla. Explain in-depth technical terms like trackers and cookies. Allow people to meaningfully choose a default protection level. Make it possible for them to select or join advertising audiences. That's very important language, rather than being targeted or tracked and placed into audiences. Along with offering Global Consent Manager, offer a machine-readable message similar to Do Not Track, the Do Not Track header, that links an individual's terms of service. This is something that's gone around a lot. Doc Searles and some others have thought about this idea a lot. Is there a way to create an API or some header that attaches to a person that says what their terms of service are? It's really the same thing as an individual control, but maybe less messy for the person to deal with. All right, consent. So again, design and enact individual controls that are easy to understand and use so that the necessity of getting consent is less important. Consent should be required for anything outside of service functionality that was mentioned above. This is not to say users should be bombarded. They should not be bombarded, but that consent should be used as a default. Instead, it should be viewed as an opportunity to give users the tools they need to control their data and to give them contextual information about what giving or not giving consent might mean in different circumstances, which is the risk threat index. Map data flows. Some of this is internal for the publishers. Ensure that if a request for consent is asked, it's done in a prominent way apart from the privacy policy and terms and condition. Just feel like we have to put that in there. And make sure that if consent is given, it's documentable, able to be easily withdrawn. These are all GDPR components, so very important to make sure we get those right. And here's an example of one way to do onboarding consent through the Shorenstein Center. So this might be something that Mozilla looks at as far as UX UI. This might be something that an API addresses in our system. Subscription and membership models is something that I actually could really use some help on, making sure that any kind of option, include options for privacy-enabled browsing of content without a loss of user experience or access to all content. And I know this is tricky. There's a lot of guidance that is contradictory here. How do you offer subscription models that aren't discriminatory? You can offer financial incentives through CCPA, but then you have the UK ICO telling the Washington Post that the way that they did it was not okay, which was sort of you pay or we track you. So finding a balance in there is tricky, and so we're working on this a little more, so anybody who joins us, that would be helpful. Yeah.
So I realize this conversation is really about the data that is collected from you, from your online behavior, most of the part. But when you get to that subscription and especially membership model, so would these privacy and consent policies also apply to other means of collecting information? So in public media, we have a membership model. We use a CRM in Salesforce. We collect mounds and mounds of information about our members that doesn't have anything to do with their browsing behaviors.
You mean you buy it from other sources? Or
No. Like we might know in our CRM of one of our high-level donors that they have a dog named here, and they really care about donating to PETA or something. So
how do you know that?
Wealth Engine.
Yeah, we know
So
that
you're getting it from somewhere else,
or they tell us that.
Or they
so
tell
we
you
have
that's
we have
different.
ways where people may contribute information. They may be talking to a membership coordinator, or they may submit it through a form, or they may comment on when they make a donation, what's important to them. And we store all that data so we can know them very well. Do these policies, I assume, when you're talking about a privacy policy, it isn't isolated to your online behavior that links to an advertiser, because in a membership model, it is all about how much we know about people, how we can build a relationship with them. So would you just clarify that?
Yeah, sure. This policy does not stop when you are a member or when you have a subscription. What is laid out here continues through that. What does change is your relationship with the user financially, right? And in some ways, the risk level for them goes up because you have financial information about them. The information that you have about them that they tell you,
right?
Maybe if you have a subscription model, you're asking for more, and that's fair.
Yeah.
But upending and bringing in data without their permission is not.
Right. I just want to clarify, that goes back to that 15-day rule, is sort of that the information that you may collect, even if it's offered to you voluntarily and all of that, is sort of that's over the long haul. And I just want you to make sure you're considering that kind of data, so its utility and the functionality goes way beyond giving them an ad on a website. It's about building a long-term relationship with them.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful.
Actually, what I'll add is that for a site I'm not going to mention the name, but, anyway, there are sites that do advertising and donor, and they may, in fact, be taking information from advertising history and applying it to their donation system, so they know if you really care about cars and you're a high-level donor, they might want to invite you to an event, a car-based event.
Right.
Like a Ferrari event. So these things are actually connected for a lot of organizations.
Okay.
Is it anticipated that Is it anticipated that Google and Facebook are going to have to do significant changes to how they, under CCPA, to how they're able to present ads based off of their knowledge of their users?
Is it anticipated that they will have to in general?
I mean, because
Or
one of the big concerns I would think is looking
answer
at
is no,
a comparative disadvantage that's being now imposed upon the publishers to create compelling advertising offers in comparison to Facebook and Google. Because, I mean, we could have a situation in the name of privacy that the balance even tilts obviously more towards Facebook and Google because they have greater knowledge and greater resolution that they can present.
The reason that they do is because they have built a lot of products and services, originally, that require people to log in. So they know who you are.
Yeah.
Right? That is why.
Like, I mean, they're going to get, it's a knife fight, and they're going to get stronger.
So this is a shiv. No, I mean, I think I hear what you're saying, and the relationships with Google and Facebook will change for sure, but I don't think they have to be adversarial. I think
It's not the relationship necessarily with them as a vendor. It's the fact that for an advertiser who's still going to wake up with the same desire to reach the audience that has the greatest resolution, they're just going to say, forget it with these other guys. Like, I can get all the scale, all the resolution I need from Facebook and Google,
Well, I think
and that's
scale
it.
is
It's
the
over.
key point you're making, right? And scale is a huge challenge here. There's no doubt. It is a challenge. You cannot compete with lots of bots, right? And so I would say that in some ways, when you're going the Facebook Google route, you are taking on a whole lot of risk and a whole lot of uncertainty and a serious lack of transparency. In this kind of system, you don't have the same scale initially.
The you being the advertiser?
Yeah, you being the advertiser.
It's like 100% addressable inventory, so they have a less chance of fraud than a non-logged in environment.
Are you talking about Google and Facebook?
Yeah.
Okay, I would not agree with you there.
But isn't it true that the optionality to remove myself or not have somebody do that is going to come to everybody?
Yeah.
Right, so it is going to affect, we're ahead of the curve in this conversation, but I got to believe that eventually Facebook and Google are going to be able to put in a position, just like we're discussing here, where you have to give me the option,
Yeah.
right?
I think that's true.
In the absence of that,
Yeah.
this is I'm with Gary. This is all an exercise of futility. If that doesn't happen, I don't know when it's going to happen, but it's going to happen.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think they're doing a lot to try to change what CCPA looks like. But I think at the end of the day, they are going, yes, that is true. I think they are going to have to start asking, and people have to self-identify into audiences anyway.
Why do you feel these don't apply to Google and Facebook currently?
Why do I don't.
Why do you feel that these privacy rules don't apply to what Google and Facebook are doing?
No, I do. I do think they will. I think right now, a lot of this does, but a lot of it doesn't, right? Because part of what Google, let's talk about Google, and I think someone mentioned this yesterday, they've pushed a lot of this onto their publishers, at least the Google advertiser publisher scenario. So they have responsibilities in terms of processing, and I think that that's fine, and they take care of that. But as far as this sort of granular control and asking for types of consent, they have not taken that on, not really. They've pushed that.
Yeah, there's the tracking that Google and Facebook want to do, and then there's the tracking that the browser will let them do. Right now, Facebook Container is a tremendously popular tool on Firefox. There are people who are talking about doing some of the same kind of thing for YouTube, and so there's always going to be a balance between regulation, privacy technology, and what level of tracking and targeting can be achieved. And when a lot of effort flows into a single platform or a small number of platforms, then it's going to attract a similar level of attention from the privacy side, from the regulator side. So it's always going to be a balance. The challenge is just for the publisher to come out at a reasonable level of market power in user data.
All right, let's run through the rest of what's
Sorry.
in your report.
Okay, I'll just try to go through it quickly. So we talk about access, correction, deletion, portability. I'm going to add some stuff about portability that OTI has come up with some language that I think is really useful. And And we can talk a little bit about, in the working group, about machine-readable formats and coming up with some standardization. I think that's important, or at least to push that. Oh, I'm sorry. It's an Open Technology Institute at the New America Foundation. Our Eric Knoll is the senior counsel there. He was a part of this committee. So prohibitions, I'm sure that these might be also open for debate in the working group. And so you can look through those. They're really what we're trying to do is cut off things like biometric data, which I realize may be something that changes in the future. And I'll talk about how you can change things in the future based on a values framework. Precise geolocation. I really cannot think of why a publisher or anybody really needs that. You can have location, but you don't need precise geolocation. And this also relates to the household data. Social widgets should not automatically send data to social networks or other third parties by default. Let's get that crap off the publisher sites if we can. And certainly, if there are some on there, they should not be default sending stuff. Collection, sharing, and use. Again, these are somewhat repetitive, but the idea here is more about data impact assessments and behavioral analytics. So you can look at that. And I say that they should be limited because they can indirectly identify somebody, and directly, I should say here too. This is an example of how you might deal with algorithmic processing, which is a part of the right to explanation in the GDPR. The idea here is show people how you may have arrived at a certain conclusion about them and how you may have asked them why you've asked them to go into a certain category or not. The more information, the most easily digested, the better. Security, use the breach notification process and timeline in the CCPA and GDPR. I realize that's really hard. I know 72 hours is tough. And a lot of people have said that, but I think that it's not impossible. And we're just talking about notification. I think there are ways to notify within 72 hours that are reasonable. Encryption. We didn't come to a lot of consensus on whether or not to use certain standards related to encryption, like NIST standards or others. So I welcome feedback on if you think that there are some that we should put in here. Making sure that you are clear about your security responsibilities and you're clear with your vendors about your security responsibilities and that you have contractual relationships requiring those. Readability and accessibility, something you do not see in policies. It drives me insane. You need to make it not confusing for people without a law degree. Write it in a conversational tone and try to have audio, video, things that make it much easier for people to understand. Because again, the goal here is a communication, not a liability necessarily document. And then I just have sort of what the privacy policy should include. So the values framework idea here, this is a limited example of it, but that's where we started as a committee in writing this. And the reason was to raise up what the values are that the LMC members are trying to put forward. Not only does that help establish that baseline, it creates a decision-making framework for when things change, which they do. If we decide that we're going to start collecting biometric data because it's a part of authentication, and all of a sudden the tech stack changes to deal with that, we have to look back at the values framework and say, is the way we're doing this respecting the idea that data represents people and people deserve fairness, respect, and protection, right? So essentially this is what the values framework is. So then we wrote a draft privacy policy. This is sort of an excerpt from the actual LMC policy that will be presented to them. And so again, it's trying to be kind of funny, but also conversational, something that people aren't just going to be like, which is what we mostly do. And again, asserting right away that privacy is a fundamental human right. That's got to be the first and foremost value. And you'll see here there's a privacy values page. There's an easy peasy version of the policy at the end, so it's like a one-pager if people just want to skim briefly through it. It talks about the rules of the road. It talks about the data we collect and why. It goes through all of these things. It calls out certain things like cookies and location that we know tend to be somewhat sensitive for people, devices, data storage, kids. And then we talk about data sharing only with your permission, what that looks like. Something I did add here is having a transparency report on law enforcement requests. I think as an advocate that's really important. Subscription, payment information. keeping your data safe, knowing your rights, changes, and complaints and questions. All throughout this policy, there is a refrain of if you have questions, if you want to contact us, if you're not sure what this means, contact us, get in touch with us. And I think that should also be a part of the regular communication with users to make sure that they understand what's going on, that they have the information they need in the language they need it in too, right? Not just audio, video, but Spanish, Chinese, English, others, making sure that it's accessible. And then this is the sort of boiled down version. Again, we have the privacy values, the individual controls. So trying to extrapolate what I might think is the most important thing about this policy, not what your lawyers might think is the most important thing about this policy. And I do have two-factor authentication in here. Yeah, so I think that's essentially it. Any questions? I think I've gone way over my time. Sorry.
It's a lot.
I know it is. I know it is. So we will go through all of this in the working group. Please join. Are there any last questions, though, before I do? Dan. It's worth it.
So I apologize. I don't think I'm going to be part of the working group. I'm working on the tech stack, but I just want to throw something in that y'all can deal with.
Yep.
I saw a reference to kind of something that would poke a hole in access control. So I haven't seen any of the privacy structures deal with the idea of copyright and property rights in all the copyrighted content that a publisher has.
Uh-huh.
And CCPA is a state thing versus federal copyright.
Uh-huh.
I would just ask, think about that concept, because as soon as we step through and say that a publisher doesn't have the right to protect their content and sell it or set the terms for access or what have you,
Uh-huh.
it just opens up a big hole on, is that really your property, right?
Well, I think that would go under terms of service, no? I guess that's where I was envisioning that sort of.
Well, it relates to the discrimination topics, things like that, right? But the hard part is that there's this spectrum. It's like, maybe I want to do offer special election reporting that requires a new reporter to do election reporting. And to do that, I'd either like you to buy that or allow me to do personalized ads to you so you can get this special election reporting. But if I'm not allowed to control access to that because I'm not allowed to discriminate or what have you, then it pokes a hole in protecting your copyrighted content.
Well, you're not allowed to discriminate, and what that means is you can't give it for free to some people and charge other people.
It sounds like
Right.
it's something that we should look into.
Okay, you should join the group.
Well,
I hear what you're saying, though.
and
I think
also
it's covered.
I think that in addition to joining the privacy group, obviously we're going to have more time for comment and feedback. So joining
Yeah.
the group is not the only chance you'll get to comment on this.
Thank you all for your feedback, though.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, so we have
Sure.
one last quick
Oh, I left my
committee
computer.
report from the governance committee.
But let's quickly just do a time check.
Oh, okay.
It's like, and then we will have time.
Okay.
So, Todd Esklin, I'm going to ask you to join me. We're going to take like about 5 minutes to do the governance thing, because really, for the most part, if you're interested, just come join us. But if you look here quickly, plan is we'll try to wrap by 11, in other words, within 8 or 9 minutes. At 11, let's both go get a coffee break, but also start the first breakout, which will last for about 45 minutes, and then we have to come back in this room at 11:45 in order to hear Johnny Ryan, who's going to be zooming in from Dublin. And so, just so you understand how this works, we have access to the room next door. It's got tables in it. So I think what we probably ought to do is have 2 breakouts in this room and 2 breakouts in the other room, and we'll just go to opposite ends of each room and think about, could you be thinking about which breakouts go to which 2 rooms while we're talking? Okay, so let me get up our little quick presentation here. And oops, that's not the one, that's this afternoon's. This one. Okay, so I'm going to actually start by going to the end and just asking you to note that and the URL is on the board over there. if you are interested in this stuff and want to know more, there's the URL, okay, that we're working from right now. But now let me go back to the presentation and back up to the top and just say that, so this has been the work of the Governance Task Group, and Todd Eskelson, who has a background in helping form nonprofits and co-ops, including the Bluetooth SIG, has been invaluable in helping think through some of this stuff. So the key governance stakeholders here are three. The public, and that is to say, the public as represented by NGOs and constituent groups, but broadly, the key stakeholder. Where is it? Oh, yeah. Broadly, the key stakeholders are is the public. Yeah, okay. And then second of all, publishers and content providers, and then third, network facilitators and operators who run the system. And IDSP is, I'm not sure if this is a common term, but we're using it to describe an identity service provider. A publisher might be an identity service provider, but an identity service provider might not necessarily be a publisher. We could imagine there could be ITAGA members who don't publish anything, but they're in this business of being sort of information valets, helping people manage their identity. So the activity that governance is designed to support is the key elements and features and challenges right here. Assist in an operating network. Possibly we might set up a for-profit subsidiary to do that, but more likely we'll be working with for-profit vendors, contractors, assignees. So the key work of ITAGA is to be a governing authority and help managing global identity management. Also potentially working with partners like AAM on auditing and making sure that people are playing by the rules, and an enforcement body for rules and protocols, and enabling the things that we've mentioned there. Features: address the problem of first-party identity, set up a federated authentication SSO, single sign-on system, and potentially work with identity wallets like Sovereign that you'll hear about after lunch. Facilitate an anonymous user data exchange of the type that we were talking about previously when we were just on a few minutes ago. Compliance auditing, a sanction process, and ensuring consumer privacy control. Sort of an ICANN for identity. If you think of what ICANN does, ICANN manages the physical addresses of websites and makes sure there isn't fraud there. What we want to try and do is be that for identity. So what we're trying to support in the governance structure that you'll hear about in the breakout is authentication, authorization, single sign-on this year, profile sharing, schema, privacy compliance, and some things to think about for the future as well. So I'm going to skip over challenges and just say that here's where we're at right now. We are a California Public Benefit Corporation, incorporated in 2017. The IRS granted us 501c3 status later in 2017. You can see what exists already, a 5-member board, bylaws in place, but they can be modified as time goes on. And then these are the key missions from the bylaws of the Information Trust Exchange Governing Association. R&D, adopting technology protocol standards, helping manage privacy. And now what I'd like to do is ask Todd to come up and just talk a little bit about the things that are going to be in our breakout.
Okay, what we're trying to do is to put in place the infrastructure that governs the organization and how that organization moves forward, so that as all of these issues come up, they can be dealt with in a fashion that all of the constituents have a place to talk, have a seat at the table, have the ability and an understanding of what is the process by which the discussion will occur and the changes will be made, and what's the vetting process that goes, and to identify any issues that need to be addressed and taken up and then dealt with in the future, and how that then can come back and adjust the organization itself in doing things. And I'm going to start pushing buttons and we'll see whether anything happens. Oh, yes, okay. So we'll have various levels of control or various levels of participation, I think is the best way to say it. a tiered governance structure. Because of the multitude of stakeholders that we have to have various membership classes, and we have to be able to define among those classes of membership what are the relationships and obligations. We also have to support the auditing and enforcement and make very clear what the rules are so that if you violate those rules, it's very clear what happens. So what we're thinking of right now is a policy board that would be established as the final arbiter on everything. That would be the group that you come to make the final decisions. We would hope that those would be the big thinkers and the ones who could implement the broad multiple balancing that needs to happen. There'd be an executive board to take care of the day-to-day kinds of things and the, have the regular meetings. Technical boards at various levels because, there are a lot of technical issues that will have to be looked at, addressed, developed, and understood, and specific working groups to which you can assign the various issues so that they can come up with the recommendations that then can flow up back through your board system to come to the point where you get final policy board decision. We would not anticipate that most decisions would come back to the policy board. We would hope that the constituent boards could take care of most of these things, and hopefully you get enough cross-pollination among there that you develop new things and better ways of doing things. So again, we'll have multiple constituencies. We have to define what those are and how those fit. Governance committee has to work our way through that and talk about that. And we may actually even need to have the ability to add new membership groups and perhaps to delete old membership groups as technology changes or as things develop. So the way we're setting it up is a contractually defined relationship. That will be evidenced in articles and bylaws, probably a membership agreement that you'll come to through some kind of a click-through arrangement. And that will incorporate references to things like the privacy policy and the other rules that are set up, and we'll be developing standards and protocols and again establishing the framework by which the technical people establish the standards, protocols, privacy rules, etc., that then get adopted by everyone within the organization. Membership rights and obligations, you'll agree to these things. You'll say that I'm coming in, I'm going to agree to these things. This is what will happen. We may have various different levels, and perhaps one area that we still haven't worked through, but I think governance probably has to take a leading role and incorporate lots of other folks, is how are we going to finance this whole thing? I mean, do we do it through a membership model? Do we do it through a transactional charge? What's the deal? Somehow we've got to finance it, not make a profit, but get enough money to be able to do this, which will not be inexpensive, particularly if we start thinking about what do we have to do to develop the value of the brand that we're going to use to say, here we are, and we really are something that you should be doing. So that governance participation will have to define who's allowed to come into what groups and what are the requirements when you enter into that group. You'll agree to audits. You'll agree to access of the trademark, perhaps, and the IP that we're going to develop, and perhaps some best practices or other things that will give you access into the environment, the safe, secure environment, and will give you the right to participate in this governance structure. And we don't really, we just at the title, we talk about sanctions. We have to set up what are the sanctions and how do they get imposed, what level of due process you get if you've been accused of violating these things, and then how big a hammer do we have and how hard can it come down on you. So that's all things we have to discuss and define, and it's a big work, big lift.
Oh, I guess hold your questions for the breakout if yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
I just want to put the
That's great.
back up again.
So the governance breakout will be over in that room. How many people think they want to go to the tech stack? Okay, how many people think they want to go to the Global Consent Manager? Okay, Global Consent Manager will be over in that room, and UX Experience. I actually am also going to put the tech stack. How many people are staying for the privacy? Okay, I also am going to put the tech stack over there, and have the privacy be in here. Okay?
Yes,
So
say again,
three groups over there and one group here. The only group here is going to be privacy.
Got
Okay? So we can go now, and then we'll just, the groups, actually, I think you'll have not that much time right now. Take a bio break, do the groups, and part of the idea will be in the groups, what I'm going to urge the group leaders to do is set up an agenda for the afternoon. I think that's what you can really get going now, is figure out what things can you accomplish this afternoon, what are your main to-dos, and what needs to happen later on. Okay, great, let's get going.
And back here at 11:45 to see Johnny Ryan.
He will wait. There's no way we're going to get back into this. Okay, why don't we send him an email now? Yeah.
So I would say, if I were you, I would stay here with the privacy, because that's the most controversial stuff.
I have a question. Is there an assumption that members that are part of this network will no longer have local logins?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the idea would be that your local login potentially can work.
Yeah,
within
okay.
this
Because it
environment,
sounded like
not
Brendan
necessarily
was
has to.
describing the thought that all of the members would use the network login.
Oh.
Rather than
He did sort of
shared
imply
login,
that.
where there's no network login. Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yeah, okay. All right, cool. Yeah, I'll take a look at it. Thank you for letting me know that. That's pretty helpful. Yes. It's really hard.
And also just that again, yeah, we don't really fully know what CCTV, we don't even fully know how GDPR stuff functions. So there's just so much mess. Pushing this
page. So we're gonna,
You're live streaming.
yeah,
this
live
too?
stream, yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's what Bill said. So I'm trying to figure out, are you kind of moderating? So you just put this on and then just hand the mic to everybody else?
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
You don't need it for the other room too?
No, we're just streaming this.
Okay. Very important. I'll do it.
Yeah.
I'll put it up. Sorry. Hey, Bill.
And I know the advertising business somewhat.
Yeah, no, I
Did
mean,
for 18 years.
it would be wonderful, I would love to have at least one person in the advertising
Yeah.
as well. Do we have any?
I don't know. I'm not.
Like,
What's your
we're
name? My name's Joe, by the way.
Hey, I'm Dylan. I'm with Public Knowledge. We're a nonprofit public interest group here in town. So we're on the advocacy
Actually,
side.
let me see if I can get access.
Michelle,
Yeah.
do we have anybody who is actually from the advertising side in this group coming?
I thought so.
I think it's really important.
I do too. I thought they were. Maybe they're just taking a break.
That's fine.
But I was hoping to,
Getting
yeah.
them up and doing the thing.
Get their muffin, come back, rip my policy apart. Just kidding. Oh shoot. All right, so let me, for some reason I'm not on the Wi-Fi, but I will share the document with all of you, see if something
Definitely,
like that.
that'd be super helpful.
And actually I could probably, since we're in here, I could just put it up. Do you guys remember the Wi-Fi password?
It's artistic.
Oh, right. Okay.
Over there? Definitely.
That's right. That's right.
Here's a comment.
And I
Success.
Yeah,
Am
I think
saying?
so, yeah. I
Okay.
emailed about it.
So you
Yeah, I
your,
saw that. That was,
your
yeah, okay.
clients are
Okay.
publishers? Is that the?
I'm corporate counsel from the flagship.
Oh, okay.
So we are a member of the LNC.
Yeah.
So we're done.
Right now we are, most people are like, what's McClatchy? But thanks to Devin Nunes, now people know who we are.
That's true.
It's one of those things where I can justify the exorbitant legal fees we're paying outside counsel to get that dismissed, but it's obviously going to be dismissed because it's great PR.
It is.
We could have spent $500,000 on the marketing campaign and not gotten nearly this much press.
Do you guys want me to share the document with you?
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
What are your email addresses, if you don't mind me asking?
Dylan@publicknowledge.org. DYLN.
So can I actually,
How you doing?
I'm Joy with CPP.
Hi, yes.
I'm here to learn. Can I actually get, are the recommendations published online somewhere?
So I'm just
sending it out
I'm
right
gonna
now.
share
Sending
it
out
with
right now.
everybody.
Oh,
Yeah,
great.
they're not published online, but I'm gonna share.
I am M. Eason, E-A-S-O-N,
Yep.
at McClatchy.
Actually have it, yep.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
And I actually
Joy.
can't make, I have some big meetings in the afternoon, so
Okay.
I can't make the afternoon session, but I'm really interested in this. I
Okay,
think
good,
it's a really
good.
hard topic.
It's really hard.
It's like, because I was just remarking that there's like a whole public education thing, you know.
Yeah, oh my
Coming
God.
from the journalism perspective,
yeah,
often
I
talks
think
about
so.
media literacy, but so directly tied to data literacy.
Yeah, yeah.
And,
A lot of this, I think, and some people have referenced the public relations that has to be a part of it. And so we've come up with a little bit of a plan related to that, and we'll talk about some of that at lunch too.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I have to leave at 1, so hopefully I'll
Okay,
be
so
able
you'll
to
catch,
like catch
it's
some
on,
part
it's
of
called
it.
Privacy Town. So
It's
you'll
called
see
what?
Privacy Town. And it's a way to pilot some of the messaging. So we'll see. Joe, I think I have
You
yours,
have
but
Jay McDonough at the Media Trust.
Jay McKay. I thought I had you. I don't know.
You've emailed me in the past.
Yeah, I know. At the Media Trust?
Yeah, at themediatrust.com.
Is this part being recorded too?
Yeah, I guess so. Which I think is kind of weird.
Yeah, can we not?
I would prefer not to. Yeah. Yeah. I don't think so either.
Okay, we make sure.
Yeah. Yeah. People would prefer that we didn't live stream this part. Yeah. The group's decided. Shauna, how are you? I'm glad you came.
Yeah,
Good.
thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, cool. Come on over. People have said that they don't want this part live streamed.
Okay, so this is related to Bill.
Yeah, that's okay though. He'll be okay with it. They just didn't.
Okay.
They want to have more.
Okay.
I guess.
Oh, I will constantly
I could go into space.